The end of the 1970s, and specifically 1979, were one of the most transformative periods in the history of Grand Prix racing. What Colin Chapman and team unleashed upon the world of motorsports with their revolutionary ground effect Lotus 79 for the 1978 season immediately sparked imitations across the paddock. And more with Renault's pioneering win at the 79 French Grand Prix, the turbo era had arrived. It was a watermark time of innovation and ingenuity. The sport was as exciting and dynamic as ever, and it was a spectacle to behold. This is a casual look at Grand Prix 1979, a mod for rFactor 1 by a team known as Grand Prix Classics. Released back in 2007, GP79 is a milestone of third-party modding. Originally started as a mod for Jeff Crammond's Grand Prix 4, the Grand Prix Classics team quickly moved on with their efforts to the new rFactor platform for its release, promising to deliver accurate ground effect turbo physics to fully realize this dramatic era. Grand Prix 79 set out to recreate the full 1979 Formula One season in never-before-achieved stunning detail. And I'd say they achieved it, featuring 40 unique cars across 17 teams and the full 15-race calendar of period-correct circuits. In historic mode, this mod can be run race by race with fully accurate grids down to the very drivers and chassis which took part. It should be no surprise that the Grand Prix Classics team was largely made up of members of the Grand Prix Legends community, and their dreams to create a Grand Prix Legends 2 of sorts for a new era. Therefore, the depth and care to construct a fully immersive experience at a time when modding was largely single, bespoke cars or circuits mashed together was a breath of fresh life into sim modding. GP79 was a mod on another level, more fully featured than most standalone sim racing titles of the time. For many, it was the reason to get rFactor and became an instant classic, spawning numerous enhancements and conversions, imitations, and sequels. It set the standard for what could be done in the highly moddable sim world. And despite being a relatively early rFactor mod, it still sits proudly amongst many's top 10 lists to this day. It was dubbed the dawn of the turbo era simulation by Car and Driver editor Steve Smith. I think GP79 deserves a closer look. So I want to go through some of what the mod has to offer, and it really is just a mod for rFactor. You install it like you would any other mod, but it totally transforms the sim. Now, like I mentioned, there's several different versions of this mod. I'm actually going to show off today version 2.01, which is not the most up-to-date or most recent version, and I do recommend installing the most recent version you can find, but this one is the last one that was released by the core team back in the mid-2000s when this was coming out. So I see it as the most complete original edition, kind of a fun one to take a look at. But there are more updates than what you're going to see here today, even for the original rFactor, but it's also been converted to almost every sim that's out there. There's a really nice rFactor 2 version, versions for Automobilista, GTR2, take your pick, whatever sim you enjoy, but the original rFactor, there's something really special about it. When you do install the mod, at least this version, it does come with 3 separate technical mods that you can pick from. There's the historical edition, which is the one I'm going to mostly show off here today. You'll see in just a second there were a ton of different cars that raced throughout the 1979 season. It seems like at almost every race a team was trying out something new, different liveries for lots of different tracks. So the historical edition is the one that simulates that. When you pick the track, it's going to pick the real grid that raced there, including the real cars and variations and everything that makes F1 really unique. Highly tuned for offline racing, and that's something I'll say about this mod in general, is offline racing is very good in it. It's not something you can say about every rFactor mod out there, but they did a great job with this mod. There is an unrestricted edition, and this one has all the same features that the historical edition does, but doesn't restrict, as the name would suggest, what you can race at different races. So if you want to race the 1978 Ferrari throughout the whole season, you could do that. If you want to race Team Lotus's miserable Lotus 80 at any race, you could also do that as well. And then lastly, you have the League Edition, which from my understanding is very similar from the Unrestricted Edition. Lets you pick any car that you'd want to drive, but has less rules as to how they're all grouped together. Doesn't contain the same updating system that we'll see in the Historical Edition. Not meant for offline racing, definitely meant for online racing, as the name would suggest. So we'll go through some of the different teams and cars that are included and show you how this works in the mod. The 1979 season of Formula One, I believe 18 18 different teams actually raced during the season, much different than today. Single cars were allowed, you didn't have to have multiple cars on the grid, and with the Cosworth engine, it was very easy, relatively, to create your own Formula One team. But we'll start here looking at Jody Scheckter's Ferrari 312 T4. Ferrari won the Manufacturers and Drivers' Championship with Jody Scheckter in 1979 with this car, and I never really liked how this car looked, although it has grown on me over the years. There's a really interesting front end on it. But if you look at the results from the season, this car, although it was most consistent over the season, it wasn't really the quickest car. The Williams probably takes that credit. But it shows just how diverse the 1979 season was, that this car ended up winning the whole thing. We take a quick look into the upgrade section. So all of the cars feature upgrades. I talked about this a little bit in the rFactor overview I did of the original rFactor itself, but this is something that was utilized in these types of mods for rFactor, and I want to say this was one of the first that heavily utilized it, although I don't know if that's 100% true. A couple of the upgrades are not necessarily upgrades in the normal sense. They're not going to change the car's performance, but does control some of the different settings with the car and how your controls interact. All of the cars have power steering assist levels. I always race this on the lowest setting for modern controls. The first setting's around a power steering setting, so how heavy is the steering. You know, Formula One cars in this time didn't have power steering, so they would actually have pretty heavy steering compared to a modern car, especially under load from the ground effect. So that can be adjusted. There's also shifting style, depending if you have paddle shifters, which was very common in 2007 when this came out, or if you were lucky enough to have a gated shifter, you could install that upgrade so that you could shift with an H pattern. That changes some of the settings and how the gearbox actually reacts in the sim, put the proper delay and everything in there. Yeah, and you can see here, disables the shift and clutch timing values so that you can go as quick as your feet and your shifting arm will allow you. Then lastly, we get to the most interesting piece of this, and that's the model. This is where you can change the actual car model and how the car will actually drive. This is not a visual only change. This is actually physics and everything swapping between the cars. So the Ferrari team itself ran 3 different cars in 1979. They have the T4, this is the normal car, the one that you'll see in all the photographs. They also had the T4 Slow, which this had a shorter rear wing. Pop it into the full screen view so you can see it a little bit better. But this was used at some of the slower tracks. I know Monaco for sure. I guess where they maybe don't need as much straight line speed, move the rear wing up so it gets a little more downforce. Then we actually have the Ferrari 312 T3, which was the 1978 car, much closer to the mid-70s Ferraris that were raced. But this was actually raced by the Ferrari team for the first few rounds of the season until the T4 came out. This was the non-ground effect car, I believe, and really wasn't a very good performer comparatively to the T4, but very interesting that you can race it, and it's one of the cool things to try out the different cars and see how the season progressed. It's fun to do all of the races throughout the season in the actual cars, and I'll learn a little bit what those drivers were feeling as the different teams had different advantages throughout the season. So then we'll look at the legendary Team Lotus and the car that really started it all, or brought it to the forefront anyways, the Lotus 79, so famously successful throughout the 1978 season, bringing Mario Andretti the championship with Ronnie Peterson alongside. 1979 was not the year for Team Lotus though, especially after the beginning of the season. They used this car primarily throughout the year, but it was the Lotus 80, which they had developed specifically for 79, which ultimately was a failure. And of course, included in the mod is the ill-fated Lotus 80 here in its original configuration, essentially without wings. I think Colin Chapman's idea was to have a fully ground effect car, no wings at all, just side skirts and a ground effect to provide the car downforce. It's a really cool looking car, very interesting car to read about. From what I've read, it ultimately failed because it was too sensitive. The ground effect itself was too sensitive, too hard to sustain, and any kind of variation in the track or the driving would lead to massive downforce loss. That was quite normal in ground effects cars, but where you had one that depended entirely on ground effect, it really was a detriment to the car overall. They did end up fitting some more traditional wings to the car, and I think Mario Andretti made several starts of Grand Prix with this car, but it really was never successful. The wings ultimately destroyed the whole concept and just made it a less superior ground effect car. The front wings often, you'll see few of the cars don't have front wings. The front wings would block the air from going under the car, so kind of negating that ground effect. Definitely a balance in how you place your front wings. Front wings or more traditional overhead wings will work in slower speed corners and things, but the ground effect's really all about that high speed downforce or relatively high speed downforce. So having some wings on the car kind of ruined the effect, total loss of a car, and really meant that 1979 was not Lotus's year. Got very much here an imitation Lotus 49 with Tyrrell's 009 chassis raced by Didier Pironi and Jean-Pierre Jarier. Tyrrell themselves not nearly as successful as they were earlier in the 70s and had abandoned the six-wheel concept by this point. They had a couple podiums in 1979, and it's a capable car, a nice one to drive, very balanced, but certainly not the quickest on the grid. This car does feature a few different options with a Monaco type that's got some more wings and things you can see on the front of it, as well as this USW, and I think has some higher side pods that were run towards the end of the season. Something I did want to point out though with this car, and many of them, almost all of them, do feature multiple skins as well in the mod. So we like to think of racing in the old days as the cars always having the same livery, but that was hardly ever the case. Maybe the changes themselves are a bit more minor, but from race to race, a lot of the liveries varied, not only because the cars themselves evolved, but different sponsorships, different obligations. So for Tyrrell, we do have quite a few different liveries. Some are meant for some of the different chassis, but this one I always like the Great Britain scheme with a little bit of red. A splash of red on it certainly catches the eye a bit more than the default. Team Brabham in 1979 was firmly in the Bernie Ecclestone phase of their life. A very eye-catching car, the Parlomat paint schemes with the red. Always something I enjoyed, but you'll see the Alfa Romeo on there was really their downfall in 1979. Retired from nearly every race, struggling with their flat 12 engine, I believe. But this car driven by an all-star team, Niki Lauda, Nelson Piquet. No front wing really showing off the ground effect era, the front wing again disturbing all the air, so went front wingless for most of the season. The mod itself does include the BT49, which was only driven in the last couple of races, went back to the more familiar Ford engine, and a front wing, much more stereotypical chassis of cars of the time. But overall, a bad season, one to forget for Brabham. I won't go through all the cars, but did want to take a look at McLaren. I think iconic in any era, but certainly in the 1970s. 1979 was the year after James Hunt left the team, but in his place acquiring John Watson and Patrick Tambay, and had quite an eclectic year. I think 5 different cars raced throughout the 1979 season. Very little success as well, starting off the season strong with a podium, but from there, it was pretty much all downhill. We're looking at here the M29, which rounded out the season, really the second half, starting at the British Grand Prix, and ended up being McLaren's platform for the 1980 season and into 1981. Just a quick look at the M28 and its Long Beach configuration. Löwenbräu actually on the side of the car, or Lowenbrau, as they would say here. Always thought this was a really cool paint scheme, and as iconic as the Marlboro paint scheme is, I kind of prefer this one. It's kind of hard to talk about 1979 and not talk about Ligier, one of the few teams that ran essentially the same car for the full season, the JS11. And they were very successful with it at the start of the season, winning, I think, 3 different races between Patrick Depailler and Jacques Lafitte right off the start, and kind of faded towards the mid-season, late season, maybe because of that lack of development, but were one of the strongest teams of 1979. Depailler here was actually injured outside of a Grand Prix, I believe, and Jackie Ickx took over for him mid-season. So changes like that, not developing the car, ultimately led to them fading away mid-season, not providing Ferrari a challenge, but a really fun one to drive in the mod. And then of course there's Renault, famous for achieving the first turbocharged win in 1979 for a Formula One car. The Renault turbos seemed like they were talked about as a bit of a joke at the time. The way the rules were written, actually starting in 1966, meant if you had a turbocharged engine, it had to be a much smaller capacity. I think 1.5 liters instead of the 3 liters of the naturally aspirated. But Renault worked on the turbo, finally figuring it out here with the RS10 and I believe a dual turbo to help cut down some of the turbo lag. Ultimately not a very reliable car, but it won the one that counted, the French Grand Prix, where Jean-Pierre Jabouille got the win ahead of René Arnoux, and that race ultimately remembered much more for the battle of René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve in the Ferrari. But it's really all about what were to come, and Renault definitely ushered in that turbo age that would become standard across the grid in just a couple years' time. And lastly, if we're thinking of the major teams of 1979, it's impossible to leave out Williams, finally finding success in 1979 with the Patrick Head-designed FW07. The car only came on about halfway through the season, but once it did, it was very much the class of the field and is probably outright the quickest car from the year. Won 5 races for the team in the latter half of the season, 1 for Regazzoni and the other 4 for Alan Jones. Really kicked off Williams as a contender. Frank Williams for years had fielded cars, and this was his first season with wins, but from there they were very successful for the next few years. But although looking at the top teams is a lot of fun, to me the 1970s is mostly interesting for all the crazy extra teams. Like I said, there were, I believe, 18 total teams that took part in 1979. Wolf Racing here with the WR08, driven by James Hunt. James Hunt making somewhat of a leap of faith over to the team and absolutely did not turn out well. I think Wolf Racing was just a couple years into Formula One and had great success initially in 1977 when they first debuted. Jody Scheckter behind the wheel, maybe a bit of luck from him, maybe a bit of beginner's luck. But by 79 with this car, they were no longer quite as quick. I believe in the entire season, they only finished 2 Grand Prix and actually didn't qualify for one of them. There were often more entries than could actually qualify for the race. James Hunt missing the Canadian Grand Prix late in the season. And here's one of the most outrageous looking cars of the season, the Ensign N179, driven by Derek Daly. Missed qualifying for most of the races, but definitely cooling was something they were trying to get at. I wonder if that actually cooled Derek at all, with the massive grills on the front of the nose. There's wacky stuff like this, though, that you would have only seen in the 1970s. Speaking of crazy ideas, you did have Copper Car, which was Wilson and Emerson Fittipaldi's attempt at a Formula One team. In 1979, I believe in their 5th year of competition, they were never really successful. I think 1980 was their best season, but never winning a race. Really the end of Emerson Fittipaldi's Formula One career. And after seeing what he did in kart and IndyCar in the years to follow, it's kind of a shame. You often look at the results and see how successful he was in the early 1970s, but joining Copper Car, I believe, in 76, and from then until 1980 when he ultimately left Formula One, it kind of put a dark midpoint on his career. So there's clearly a lot of fun to be had in looking through the different cars and options and reading about how the season progressed. 1979 was an extremely dynamic season. I think 6 or 7 different winners throughout the whole season, multiple different teams coming and going throughout the season. So quite a fun one to watch, certainly far from single car winning and running away with everything. You know, if you read and see that Ferrari won the championship, it really doesn't tell you the whole story. And it was Ferrari's final successful season for quite a few seasons. But maybe equally as interesting to the cars are the circuits that were raced in 1979. And one of the great things about this mod was it included a full track pack. Every circuit that was raced in 1979 built or put together specifically for this mod, made to work with the AI, and overall provides a very consistent, cohesive package for the whole season. I do think the calendar of 1979 was pretty interesting, very much classic Formula One. It's 15 races long, originally meant to be 16 races. The Swedish Grand Prix was dropped really after Ronnie Peterson had passed away. There was no more a desire to hold a Formula One Grand Prix in Sweden, so it ended up being 15 races for 1979. It was one of those seasons where the points championship counted so many races from the first half and the second half, certainly not a full season championship like it is these days. But each one of these tracks brought into rFactor in very nice detail. Buenos Aires, Interlagos, Kyalami, classic Kyalami circuit. Some of these are conversions from Grand Prix Legends, I believe Kyalami is, but a lot of detail added to them, and maybe not up to the standards what you might be used to these days, but it is very consistent, cohesive. You get a very similar experience at all of these circuits, which is not very often said in a mod for rFactor. You'll notice absent from the calendar is Spa-Francorchamps. They didn't go there for quite a number of years in the 1970s after the cars became too quick, and it wasn't until they reconfigured the circuit to the much shorter variant that they went back. But it was Zolder which held the Belgian Grand Prix in 1979. Another interesting one, and maybe we'll do a race here, is Dijon-Prenois, home of the French Grand Prix in 1979. I think later held the Swiss Grand Prix, although it's not in Switzerland, but any excuse to hold a motor race. And really was a famous race from the 1979 season, not because Renault won the first ever turbocharged power Formula One car race, but because of the battle that you can see there between René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve. Stuff of legends, definitely check that out if you've never seen it. You know, another one notably missing would be the Nürburgring, and of course, Formula One stopped racing there after Niki Lauda had his terrible accident in 1976. I believe the drivers actually banded together and said they would not race there. So Hockenheim became the home of the Formula One German Grand Prix for many years. And this is, of course, the fast, straightaway Hockenheim with some chicanes. You'll note there's a lot of chicanes on all of these tracks. really felt as though chicanes became the de facto way to make a circuit safer. They'll throw a chicane in and slow the cars down. Some of them are quite abrupt and ugly, but it's certainly a product of its times, and it's neat to have all those little variations accurate here. I think the chicanes are maybe at their worst at Monza, a few really difficult chicanes early in the lap that make passing or simply getting through alone a challenge, far away from the fast-flowing circuit of the 50s and 60s. So overall, just scratching the surface with all the different configurations and options that are available in this mod. Like I said, there's 40 different cars in total with unique physics available in the mod. Lots of little alterations, plenty of paint schemes. For somebody that enjoys Formula One history, you'll certainly have a good time looking through this. The mod itself was accompanied with a 150-page manual that talks through every single team, every single circuit, and provides a lot of the context on the 1979 season. But that's enough talking. I'm sure we're quite a ways into this video at this point. So it's impossible to show off fully what this mod has to offer, but I thought I'd do a few quick races just to give you a little taste. And to start things out, we'll go to round number 4 of the 1979 Formula One season with the US Grand Prix West at Long Beach. I think many folks know that Long Beach was a Formula One race before it became an IndyCar race, but maybe not as many know how different the circuit was in 1979. I know for myself, driving this mod back when it initially was released really opened my eyes to how different and exciting Long Beach used to be. In my book, still a really great track, but there's something extra special about this Formula One layout. So we'll jump on the track for a really quick 8-lap race, driving Gilles Villeneuve's winning Ferrari 312 T4. This was the second race for the T4 and the second in a row that Ferrari finished 1-2. Quite a start for the new car. So quite a lot to live up to, but an absolutely excellent combo. Alright, so here we are on the grid. Hopefully we can get a good start here because the AI are very quick off the line, but lights are lit. Green, we're underway. Bunch of wheels spinning first gear. Come on, get it up to second gear. Arrows and Alfa Romeo go on past, catch the wheel, then accelerate around the long right-hander on Shoreline Drive. Everybody backs up a little bit as we'll rush down now to the first corner. Heavy braking. It's a hairpin on this version to the right. We'll sneak past a few cars up the inside there, but tiptoe our way side by side. A little bit of wheel to wheel in front. Ooh, it's myself too. As now we'll come to a really narrow section. I'm side by side with a Tyrrell here to give him a little bit of space. We'll come through a twisty S though. Super high curbs, so easy to spin the car on those. But there we go. James Hunt behind me in the Wolf I can see. Now we'll come to the right and up a super steep hill. It brings us onto the back straightaway. Almost San Francisco style hills here. On the coast of California. Now up the gears down the short back straightaway into another sequence of 90-degree corners down to second gear. This one brings us downhill now though into a difficult left-hander because there's no grip. The surface just falls away. Tyrrell in front bottles it up. It's Peroni. Sneak around him to the inside. Now come to the familiar double left-hander. But instead of the hairpin being right against it, we actually have a little rundown to the hairpin. It's quite longer than it is now. But then swing it to the right, bring it back onto the front straightaway, and for the long run down, be even faster than it is these days, all the way up to fifth gear, essentially before the start-finish line. Complete lap number 1, though. Always an interesting experience here. I find the AI, once you get going, they're quite good, especially for an rFactor mod. Not to miss the braking here into turn 1. But definitely for the first couple laps, you can have some interesting incidents. I think we got away mostly clean there. And we'll try to settle in. I think I got Niki Lauda in front of me in the Brabham. We got a Lotus and a Renault. Renault, I think, is holding up the Lotus. We'll just snake it through. Tires are going to take a couple laps to come up to temperature. Just take it easy with all the power the flat 12 the Ferrari has. Definitely the class of the field around this type of circuit. This T4 loves a twisty road circuit. You can see my teammate Schechter, I think, up front there, holding up a few cars maybe. But we're running the historical version of the mod. Ooh, it's a Lotus. Oh, and Niki Lauda jumps on the rear wheels of Reutemann there in the Lotus. Try to get around these two before they cause a major incident. Get it down to first gear. I'll just sneak it up the inside. There we go. Got that Renault to the right as well. So we make a double pass there. It'll get me up to 5th position. Just an 8-lap race here, 10% of the race distance, just to give you a taste of it. Such a cool circuit at Long Beach. I love the circuit even to this day, but this 1970s version is just kind of wild with the elevation and the hills. Certainly a very unique street course. So try to hold off Reutemann behind. That Lotus 79 is quite quick. That's the Lotus 79 model from 1978. But was definitely Lotus's better car of the season. And at this point in the 79 season, like I said before, it was still a pretty competitive car, but as the season went, their 80 model never really caught on. So close in here, though, on the Renault in front. Down to 2nd gear. Really easy to run wide in any of these corners, but you do have runoff, which is something nice modeled into the circuit. This circuit built specifically for rFactor and for this mod in this version. It's one of the first circuits they released for this mod specifically too. That wasn't a Prix Legends conversion or something similar. We'll come down. Should have taken that from Jabouille in front. Try to accelerate away though. See if I can get him in the slipstream here down the front straightaway. It's of course the turbocharged Renault in front. That's the single turbo version. I don't believe the dual turbo was released until Monaco actually. There we go, 5th gear, flat out. Come down to the first corner again. He's gonna brake a bit later than me. Oh, but he's a little harder on the brakes. There we go, catch a slide in full. Gilles Villeneuve. Just catching the wheel, able to slide the car in. Luckily, the other driver thought better of it. Try to break away though. I got a little bit of a gap to the cars in front. I'll talk about the physics of driving these cars a bit in all the races that I'll do, but this car itself, Ferrari, the T4, definitely one of the easiest cars to drive in the mod in my opinion. It may not look like it. This circuit itself is quite tricky, but the car handles really well. It's more predictable than a lot of the cars. Understeer a little bit there, but overall, driving a ground effects car is not a pleasurable type of car to drive. There's actually quite a bit of information in the manual for this mod that I think there's a quote from Niki Lauda specifically talking about how it's really not the type of car that you'd want to drive. Although it's a lot quicker with ground effects, the cars just behave somewhat erratically. You get more downforce the faster you go, so it really tests the bravery of the drivers. And we saw in the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of drivers quit maybe prematurely their careers. And these cars just were not what they wanted to be driving. Maybe a little too scary, difficult, or just altogether different from what they were used to. All about threading the needle here. So this track, I think, very nice. All of the tracks in this mod are of the same detail and quality. Now, this is rFactor 1 quality of tracks, and for rFactor 1, I know there's some really impressive stuff these days, and of course, looking at this with 2022 eyes, this does not look like the most accurate track, or certainly the surface model is, I think, the thing you would think of. It's quite smooth in a lot of spots, and then there are some bumps, but they're more based off the polygon modeling of the surface rather than what the real-life surface would be. So you can't really look at it with modern eyes, although I still quite enjoy it itself. But this is so impressive for the time, and to have all 15 tracks of the season in just about the same quality for both the AI racing as well as the actual driving experience, it's a great package that just wasn't something that was available elsewhere. Certainly not for rFactor. All right, down to first gear again. I think I'm closing up ever so slightly. So the tires are now up to temperature. It's a bit easier to control. It's very skatey for the first few laps. Understeer there. You get a lot of understeer in the ground effects cars at medium to slow speed corners. Try to slide it in a bit. You can slide the cars quite a lot. The oversteer is pretty catchable. which is nice. Still have those huge tires on the rear end of the car as well. Right down to second gear here. This corner itself is, I think, one of the coolest photo positions on the circuit. You see some really great photographs from the races here of the cars snaking down that hill, especially on the opening laps, and they're all tight together. Come down to the hairpin though. I think this makes this braking zone a bit better to have that part of the circuit extended, a little loose on entry. All right, catch the wheel spin on the exit. Gonna come to 2 to go, be a very quick race. This is just 10% of the actual distance. This mod itself also features car failures and retirements and things. We're obviously racing the real grid that would have raced at the Long Beach Grand Prix in 1979. But if you did a full race with mechanical failures and things, you would see similar retirements that happened in real life. Really a great way to immerse yourself in the season. Just touch these curbs. So many tracks I mentioned have high curbs in this era, and it's interesting to see what they were thinking. The chicanes put in place really to slow the cars down. One of the first inventions on circuits to slow cars down. But I feel like the curbs almost made them more dangerous in a way. We'll snake down the back straightaway. You'll see there's a pit lane actually to the right there, and that's where the cars pit, at least during practice and qualifying sessions, up there on the hill, which I think was a bit easier to access garages and things from there. We'll come around the long left-hander. This part is really the only part of the circuit that's the same today for a brief second before we run down to the extended hairpin, down to first gear. Side-by-side in front's only going to help me as we'll come to 1 to go. Still a little bit far back, not going to be good enough to get the best passing zone into turn 1. Come across the line though, sweep around Shoreline Drive. And down to turn number 1, brake just before that 200 board, maybe a little bit earlier than I need to. Got Schechter, my teammate, out front, chasing Depailler and the Ligier, who got Lotus 79 of Mario Andretti in front. It's 1979 in full color. Oh, they both spin out in front. Oh, man. So just getting around to Paillet there as he spun out. I think Andretti as well getting a bit sideways over those tall curbs I was just talking about. All right, come around the top of the hill. So up to third, up on the podium then. So come down to second gear, just ease it through. So easy to clip the walls on the inside of the apex, right up to the wall on all the corners, and that's accurate to how it was. Come around the long sweeper. Not going to be quite close enough to make a lunge on Andretti here. He gets a good exit there. First gears, try to run through, never know what's going to happen. We'll slide the car a little bit there, come out of it. So not going to be a win or anything, but a fun little race around Long Beach. Such a great track, and really one that makes you feel like you're in 1979. So Long Beach itself provides an excellent venue for racing these cars, but Long Beach as a track, maybe not the best suited to the ground effects era. You really want a track with long flowing corners to feel that extra downforce that all the ground effect provided. So we'll move things along to what was round number 8 of the 1979 season. At the French Grand Prix I mentioned, famous for several reasons, the site of the win of Renault with their twin turbo, bringing the turbo era into Formula One, but perhaps most famous for the battle between René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve. In the final stages, Villeneuve coming out victorious for second place over René Arnoux. So we'll head to Dijon-Prenois in Arnoux twin turbo Renault and see if we can relive a little bit of that history. Alright, so here we are on the grid in France, right towards the back. Try to get a better start this time. We'll see what I can do. Lights are lit. Green. We're underway. A lot of wheel spin out of the twin turbo. Up to second gear though, lose a ton of time to the cars in front. Got Emerson Fittipaldi in his own make behind me, but come down to the first corner, see if I can squeak past a few of these guys. Rybak in front, leaving a car of his own team. There we go, up the inside. Just have to wait our time here as the field tries to work its way through the first few corners. Oh, light up the rear. There's some of that turbo lag that this car was very famous for. Switch around though to come to the inside. This is a tighter left-hand corner. Keep it in second gear. The shadow on the right there almost hitting me. Light up the tires though as we come out of it. Love how this car squirms around the track. Down to second gear, down to first maybe this lap for this long right-hander. I think they called this the hairpin. And sneaking behind a McLaren. Patrick Tambay. Down to first then for a really tight left-hander. Almost certainly clinking wheels a little bit. Try not to play bowling with the AI, but there we go. Sneak out of it. A couple fast right-handers here to end the lap. Not such a long lap at Dijon here. Really cool track, I think. Often forgotten as home of several Grand Prix. French Grand Prix, but also the Swiss Grand Prix for years. More exciting than Paul Ricard, I think. But down the front straightaway up to fifth gear in the slipstream of Brembia in the Alfa Romeo. See if we can peek up the inside into turn one, but it'd be quite the lunge. Oh, down to third gear. Almost losing the rear end there, almost hitting Brembia. We're all stuck up behind and arrows in front. You can see the wing car there, or maybe it's actually James Hunt. Come through the S's. Another cheeky move up the inside, second gear. Light up both the tires under braking. There we go. McLaren's going to follow me through behind maybe. Work it up the hill. This track keeps you plenty busy. This was a pretty smooth circuit in real life. It seems like it had fairly recently been paved maybe. The color of the asphalt itself was very dark, similar to what you're seeing here. So it was quite smooth, but the track has so much elevation change. It's almost like they paved directly over some sand dunes, which keeps it very exciting. I think it's a great track to drive in these high-powered cars. The challenging one's quite narrow. Come out of the front straightaway though. Ooh, dip a wheel on the dirt. There we go. Get up to fifth gear and use our twin turbo power to rocket on by, hopefully. Come down to turn one, right up the inside of this Alpha. Stamp on the brake pedal, down to third gear, let that ground effect help carry us around. Jochen Mass in front here in this gold arrows. We'll see that one in a second. Follow James Hunt here around the top of the hill. Switch back through the S's there. Second gear then. Just nip that inside curve. But you can see here, just like in Long Beach, the curves are just absolutely no-go zones. Very tall curbing around the circuit. Really more like mini walls than anything. Or a little hump there upsets the car quite a lot. So Hunt and the Wolf in front. It was a single car team, I believe, which absolutely didn't help their cause. See if we can get around them. We're still in 13th. Not sure we'll be able to actually get up front. Started almost near the very back. Qualifying not quite as kind to me here in the Renault. The Renault itself kind of came out of nowhere, it seems, as being a competitive car. And this was the only Grand Prix of the season it won. So I've got Mass right up behind me. With the win here at France, it was such a celebration. I believe this was the 50th year of the French Grand Prix in 1979. And to have two French cars almost finish 1-2, but still getting the win, 2 podium positions with their brand new turbo design, or unproven Formula 1 turbo design. They've been in Formula 1 for a few years, of course, but the twin turbo is what was missing, adding the second turbo to help with the turbo lag, although there's still a bit of turbo lag, and you can feel it driving this car. I'll talk about the actual modeling in the simulation here as I follow Hunt around. I'll be able to breeze past him pretty quickly. As lock up the brakes there, run a bit wide. It's the ground effect to help carry me around, right out of the dirt a little bit. A little more scraggly here than at Long Beach. You have a a little bit extra on the sides of the track. Back on the front straightaway, the arrow's masked behind me. We'll see if he tries to make a move. Not sure if he will. Sling around the outside. This car feels so much different than the Ferrari does, and it's really interesting to race them back to back. It's a way different track, this one, so maybe not the best comparison, having just come from Long Beach, but having also raced the Ferrari around this circuit, I can tell you it's a very different experience. This car doesn't quite like as much hanging the rear out as the Ferrari does. And with the turbo and the engine, the power is much different. You don't have as much low-end torque as that flat 12 has in the Ferrari, but certainly as well if you race some of the other cars that have more traditional V8 Cosworth engines, they have a lot of low end in them. Just very different driving styles. Make something like this so much more interesting than having spec type cars to drive. Always gives you something new to do. All right, we'll come to the line. Just a couple more laps to go already. Quite a quick one. I'm not going to emulate the great Arnoux Villeneuve battle here today, but we'll see if I can catch up to Hunt. Seems to be pretty much as quick as I am, although close up on him a bit into turn one here. The battle of Villeneuve and Arnoux. If you have not seen it, please go and watch that, because it's just absolute epitome of 70s Formula One. Elbows out racing with just a couple laps to go, bouncing off of each other through these corners, side by side through a lot of this track, which you can't really even imagine. The fans are going wild, rooting for the Renault, of course, of Arnoux. Second gear, try not to run too wide. We're just gonna nip the dirt there. Let's see, everybody relatively behaved here, though. We haven't seen any cars crashed off the edge of the circuit. I'm sure there were a couple wings bent up on the first couple of laps, but just like at Long Beach, once things get going, it's very nice to race the AI in this. Gives you a really good offline type championship. This Massa is going to come back on me again here. Stomp on the brake pedal down into the first corner. Ran a bit too deep there, bogged down in third gear. We're on the final lap now, or 2 to go actually. The laps representing the leader lap, so 2 laps to go. This has turned more into trying to get around Hunt. Was a slide a bit wide there. More about keeping Yak and Mass behind me. Up the top of the hill, get a little bit of a gap. It seems like I'm quicker through the slower stuff, and that slippery arrows behind. Such an outrageous looking car. Fully embracing the ground effect downforce and absolutely no wings. Pretty much what Lotus was going for with the Lotus 80, and that Arrows car pretty much as successful as the Lotus 80 was. Here he comes, though. Back on me up to 5th gear. He's got a better run this time. I think he's going to use it, though. Rocket down to the first corner on the final lap now. Down to 3rd gear. Oh, try not to run wide. Looking towards the inside, but able to close the door on him. Swing through that right-lefter. So much fun to throw the car through there. Almost go flat out. Slide it through the long left-hander. You can see how the downforce just abandons the car once you get below a certain mile per hour. We'll see it again in this corner where you really have nothing helping you out anymore. Just slide the car there up the hill, over the little hump, to the final slow corner, down to 2nd gear. A little tidier this time. Oh, rear end kicking out. Got a bit wide here. Just nipped the dirt, final corner. So quite a workout bringing the Renault around this circuit. Not able to match René Arnoux, but still quite a lot of fun. So just come ahead of Watkins here across the line. Now this is a racing car livery. This is Jan Lammer's 1979 Shadow DN9, painted in a fantastic, what they called the lion livery, I think for Samson. I'm not sure why. This car went with this livery because his teammate, Elio De Angelis, had a normal looking car, just blue and white. But this is anything but normal looking, but it's absolutely awesome. I think something that only would have happened in the 1970s. Shadow's season in 1979 was nothing to write home about. I think they only got 1 points finished in the whole season, didn't qualify for a number of races as well, certainly was a decline off their success in 77. But this car is so cool and something that really caught my eye when I originally tried out this mod back in the day. So I thought it'd be fun to race one of the slower cars since it's probably not featured too often on different videos. And maybe in a stroke of nationalism, I thought it'd be fun to take this to Watkins Glen. So we're going to do both of the US Grand Prix for this year. But Watkins Glen, of course, was a great Formula One circuit. And in 1979, the circuit looked very similar to how it is today, but had one important difference that we can go check out. All right, so here we are at a very modern looking Watkins Glen on the grid. Try to get a good start here. Lights are lit. Out. We're underway. Really quick on the lights. We'll get a terrible start once again. All the wheels spin. But there we go. Rocket now away and down towards turn number 1. Exactly like it is these days. See if I can maybe pass this arrows back up the inside. We'll be right towards the rear end of the grid in this car. A little bit of wheel spin coming out of it. We'll head towards the S's, and this is where the big difference in this circuit is the arrows still peeking up the inside there. We've got the S's chicane. It's the 2 in front trying to go side by side. That's Emerson Fittipaldi in the copper suit car. See if I can sneak up the inside of him as well. Follow Hector Ribach through in front. Try to get it up to 5th gear, side by side with Mo there. We'll stream down towards the long sweeping right-hander. There's no bus stop chicane, just nice and quick into the long right-hander, but we do have the boot, so we'll run over the top of the hill here. He's able to outbrake Emerson there, and now down into the boot. See if I can maybe use some of the downforce this Shadow has. Got my teammate right in front of me anyways. But there we go, around the outside of Ribach and down to the bottom of the boot. 2nd gear. This would have been a few years into running the boot, but we do have the S's chicane, which was put in place, I believe, in a response to Francois Cerver's accident there in 1973. The chicane first started being run in 75 and remained for the rest of the years that Formula One ran at Watkins Glen. Very interesting corner. Down to 2nd gear. We'll head back up the hill. This is a tricky left-hander, that off camber at the top, right on the apex. Just swing it through the last few corners, but otherwise this circuit relatively unchanged. Of course, the bus stop chicane not there, and some of the curbing runoffs are a little bit different. But you can see how very much the same Watkins Glen is these days after they reconfigured it in 1971, I believe. We'll come down to the first corner though. Elio De Angelis in front in the other Shadow. The less good-looking Shadow, if I do say so myself. We'll come to the S's chicane. Not really a place you'd want to pass. Maybe I can sneak by up the inside before we get there. There we go. It's a very fast chicane. You can actually still see, if you look at satellite images of the S's, a little extra pavement off to the right, which is from the chicane. It's been there all these years, even though they removed it after Formula One left. And the slipstream here, though. Oh, it's down to 4th gear. Launched it into the corner quite a bit. We got Derek Daly in front. Swing around the outside there. A lot of camber on the corner to help. Back down to 3rd. Really have to try to use as much of the downforce as possible in the Shadow here, because the engine definitely is not going to get you anywhere. But it's fun to race the lesser known cars, race towards the back with all of these cars that you really never read about or hear about otherwise. And certainly in a car that looks this good, it's not too bad. Up to the top of the hill. This corner is a bit tricky. The track falls away there. Easy to lock up the tires. Bit of a roller coaster through here. All in all, though, I think the track modeling is quite good. You can clearly tell you're at Watkins Glen. This, of course, predates any sort of ability to laser scan anything. This track itself may have been a conversion, I'm not 100% sure, but certainly had a lot of work done to it to add in things like the chicane through the S's and the correct signage and scenery. It's a fourth gear, so just a 6-lap race around here. The real race was 60 laps. It's a longer circuit, a bit of a pack race happening in front. See what happens here. Expecting some fireworks maybe. That's a fourth gear. I'll head to the chicane again. You can go very fast through here, though, like I said, and the curbs are extremely high, so almost get crossed up. Very easy if you hit the curb a little too hard to go literally flying, and Brambilla demonstrated that in the mid-70s. If you want to see some crazy photographs, search for Brambilla at Watkins Glen. My teammate right on behind me then. Daly in front, pulled away just a little bit. This car itself to drive, though, although it is quite slow, it's a very balanced car and is not bad to drive. Some of the slower cars will often have bad handling characteristics, and if this has a bad characteristic, if anything, it is understeer a little bit. But it does make it more manageable than some of the quicker cars to actually drive. It'll just be a bit slower, and you can always lower the AI ability and things to make it a bit more racy, but it is a nice car. I believe one that Ryza has modeled in Automobilista 2 as one of their fictional cars, but certainly not a remarkable car, and I believe the last full-time entry for Shadow in Formula 1. Went out with a bang, though, with this paint scheme. A lot of understeer here through that left-hander, use the curb on the right. Third gear for the final corner. It's not as much runoff here to the left through that corner as there is these days. Come across the line, start lap number 4. Just barely hanging on to the back of this group in front. This really was a pack race of sorts. Really fast track, except for the one chicane. Run a bit wide through turn 1, though. Got DeAngelis coming up the inside. So we'll head up to the chicane. Down a third gear, thread the needle again. It's a little like an uphill Monaco chicane as well. Doesn't feel like it makes the S's all that much safer. That's the general feeling with chicanes overall. If you look at the chicanes at tracks like Zolder, obviously here, even at Monaco, it feels like they make the track a bit more dangerous with the high curbing. And smooth through the boot, pulled out a little bit on DeAngelis behind. Maybe I can catch Daly if I put in some really good corners here. Second gear. Driving wise, so rFactor, I talked about it a lot when I took a look at the basic install, the default rFactor. It has aged extremely well. There's also a million mods out there to adjust things like force feedback that aren't specific to car mods, just kind of general enhancements with real feel and things like that, right up to the grass. You can make rFactor 1 feel as good, in my opinion, as any modern sim, really. It's all dependent on the content that the mods that you're racing, as to how good it ultimately will be, but I find myself not really missing anything from the driving feeling perspective, and if there's any lack of detail or vague feeling, it's mostly from the circuits, like I talked about when we were racing at Long Beach. The tracks themselves, the surface especially, is a bit simplistic modeling, and so you lack some of the bumps and things, but if the track had that detail, and there are some other versions of these circuits out there for rFactor that have more detail, these cars behave really well and they're very fun to drive, very rewarding. Fourth gear here into the long sweeping right-hander. Hopefully keep DeAngelis behind me, again in my mirrors quite a bit in this race. It's kind of what I expected with the Shadow, but it is a fun car. Everybody in front sorting themselves out a bit. Third gear here, bottom of the boot. Maybe should have gone down to second, see if I can cut the apex on the exit. To fourth gear. this mod doesn't exist for pretty much every other ISI sim out there. It was converted to everything, and the versions that exist, especially for rFactor 2 and the updated versions for rFactor 1 here, are great. And if you're going to try out this sim in Automobilista, or rFactor 2, rFactor 1, I think you'll have a good time in whatever your sim of choice is. So we'll come to the line and start the final lap. Let's see if I can hold on with DeAngelis behind me here. Lovely circuit this, though, for racing. Really good flow to it, and if it wasn't for the chicane in the S's, I'd say it's nearly perfect. Thankfully, they decided to remove this chicane after Formula 1 left, and I don't exactly know what the safety rationale is, because otherwise, the S's pretty much look exactly like this these days. Maybe they've kicked the wall out a little bit in a few spots, but it does get very narrow through there. And obviously, they added the chicane down here, the bus stop chicane, in the 90s. Otherwise, this track really hasn't changed too much. Still an excellent circuit, Watkins Glen. All right, third gear, head down the hill to the left. On the throttle early, you can see the car rotate a bit there. Easy to kick the rear end out, but it's also easy to catch it if you do. The throttle comes on, the engine horsepower comes on much more linearly in this car than it did in the Renault, but a lot less power you can feel. You just don't get that launch off corners that you do in the Ferrari or the Renault. So about the race I thought I was going to have in the shadow here. Towards the back, but beating my teammate, I guess, made a bunch of passes right at the start, and then just kind of settled in, got to the finish. But a lot of fun racing anything around Watkins Glen as we have a little moment there out of the final corner. Grand Prix 1979. A great depiction of the 1979 Formula 1 season brought to life by Grand Prix Classics. Hope you can see the care and detail that was put into this mod. When it was released, like I've said, in 2007, there really wasn't a lot out there like this, and certainly not for rFactor. It was a mod that was and still is raced online a lot to this day by different leagues and competitions and things, but I think the offline component and having the historical accuracy of race to race, different liveries, different chassis, different engines is what really makes it special. Can go along as a great companion to reading and learning about the 1979 season, to boot it up in a sim and try your hand at emulating René Arnoux or Gilles Villeneuve or Jody Scheckter in your favorite race on the calendar. So I absolutely recommend trying this one out. If not for the original rFactor and the version I'm using here, there is an updated version for the original rFactor on Race Department that includes a few extra cars that were missing in this initial release, as well as things like driver arms in the cockpit and some various tweaks and bugs, fixes, and things like that. But if you have Automobilista 1 or rFactor 2 or GTR 2, there are also versions of this mod converted to each of those sims, and I've tried out specifically the rFactor 2 and Automobilista versions, and I can also recommend both of them. So that'll do it for this casual review of this absolutely classic mod. If you enjoyed this, let me know if you'd like to see a little bit more of this, or maybe some other races and things, maybe longer races at specific circuits in specific cars. Let me know what combinations you would like. I've got some other rFactor and other mods for different sims in the works as well for future videos, but if there's anything out there that you'd like to see as well, let me know. I'm always up for trying something new. But until then, thank you for watching. This is GP Laps, and I'll see you all again next time.